Okay, so now we reach the main page. And when I say the main page, I mean this one here, the one that I'm clicked on. Just remember that when you move between these tabs here, it feels sometimes like the page isn't changing too much, but it really is. You're on an entirely different page. So for example, when we go from A to B here, this is a completely different page, although it doesn't necessarily look like it immediately. If we go over to the main page here, this is basically our access to our entire patch or our entire part. What we're looking at is part or patch 1 in this whole page, and that includes obviously layer A, layer B, C, D, the effects for the layers that we're on, the arpeggiator and the orb. But when we're on the main page, we can look at kind of a global overview of everything in this part. So let's just load up a part here. Lovely patch there. It's the first one that you've got at the top of their library. I think it's a good one to kind of encapsulate a little bit about what Omnisphere can do in terms of its sound design and its filmic qualities. So let's go over the page kind of quite sequentially. Up at the top left here, we have our voices control. Now, voices in synthesis, if I'm just going to go at all these as if you've never kind of looked at a synthesizer before. If we were to go to a simple one, actually, let me just swap to this one because I think, no, this is easier. What I can currently do with 8 voices, I can play 8 notes on my keyboard concurrently at the same time without any of them dropping out. But for example, if I change this to 1 note, and right now I'm playing 2 notes on my keyboard, I'm only able to play one of those, and it's the first one that I play. So there I'm holding down a chord, but nothing's happening. I'm only playing one of those notes. If we increase that, I'm now able to play 2 of the notes that I'm playing. So even though I'm playing about 5 or 6 notes right now, 2 of them will get chosen in terms of sort of which is the fastest ones I put down, now with 4. So if you want to kind of just restrict this actually helps your CPU usage as well. If you kind of actually don't want to have access to kind of, what's the limit, 64, which I don't know how you'd play 64 notes at the same time. You can keep it down low here. And most parts, if we reload backwards NeoSoul, they load with a kind of default amount. So for this one, it's 8. Let's see what Phoenix Rising it is. 8 as well. Looks like 8 is the default here. But sometimes you open them up and they change. You notice the thing as I was moving between patches here to the right is changing, and that's our octave. So if I'm choosing, say for example, like a bass instrument here, and I choose something from the Trillian library, and I switch back. Oh, incidentally here, what's happened is because I'm loading from a separate library here, the Trillian library, or a separate directory, which isn't part of Omnisphere necessarily, it's loaded the option of that instrument's control panel. Now, if you have that and you're like, whoa, what the hell's happened here? Just click on Omnisphere controls and you'll be back to where you were. So going back to what I was saying is we've got -1 octave there. Because we're on a bass instrument, we don't want to play C4, i.e. middle C, and have it, it's kind of easier. We don't have to want to keep reaching down to the lower parts of the keyboard. We want to be able to just play kind of roughly in front of us, and it's not going to have to, we're not going to have to pitch shift it later or anything like that. So here we make C4 actually sound like C3. If we put this back to here, middle C sounds where it usually is, but if I put it down, everything's going to be down an octave, which is kind of better for bass instruments. It means you don't have to move your hand so far down to the left. Equal temperament's a really interesting one. So it's not really necessarily equal temperament. That's the default choice. If you don't know what equal temperament is, it's basically the tuning between different notes on the piano. So the piano is divided up between 12 different notes before the notes start repeating an octave higher. And that's actually relatively new in the history of humanity. That hasn't been around for a while. And we've divided the octave into smaller and larger intervals. So you can actually choose these from here. If you've ever studied like kind of GCSE music or kind of like high school music, you may have done gamelan music. I certainly was made to do that at school. It's great music, but studying is it not necessarily so practical. And you can do different tuning systems. So here we have something called, probably going to butcher this pronunciation, but Gemblung 5-tone. And if I click that and I play up through my keyboard, believe it or not, I'm actually just playing the white notes there. I'm just playing a scale of C major, but it sounds very, very different. So you can play around with those there. There's very, very odd ones going on in there, but if you're doing a particularly filmic or kind of another, if you're doing something from perhaps like, you know, that's evoking a different scene from another country in a film score, you might want to play around with that. So next we get to clock speed. That is basically to do with the speed of your BPM in your DAW, and it's usually to do with BPM related sounds. So if we choose something along here that's kind of, I have no idea actually really what I'm going to choose here. So many different sounds. You can hear that there's kind of a rhythmical quality to this, right? And my Logic sequencer, if I just show you, if I bring this up here, is at 120 BPM. Now, if I pull that down, everything gets slower because obviously Omnisphere is connected to the clock of my instrument there. So let me just put that back up to 120, and then I'm going to pull Logic down here. If you're working with that, this is a very, very easy way for us to change the speed in double, half, and then, you know, smaller and larger increments. So if you listen to the sound here, without changing the host tempo, I can go down to half speed. Or 1/3 if you want to get like triplets, or quarter of the speed, and you can also go double and then ridiculous in terms of other speeds. So signal path is kind of an interesting one. I'm just going to show you a diagram now from the actual Omnisphere guide. It's essentially talking about the signal flow of the different layers to the output. Now you can load up different sounds. If we go back to the top here, and I believe it was this one here. Let's have it. Yeah, I think it was Phoenix Rising. Suddenly we see that this goes orange, right? And that we have these different layers have also gone orange. And that means that we're on the secondary model of signal flow, kind of a more standard old school one. But actually, when you're creating your own sounds, you probably want to think of Omnisphere in this first signal flow, where you've got everything separate, going on their own separate signal and FX paths to the final FX outputs, sorry, the FX sends, and then the final output. That's probably a better way to do it, but you don't need to worry about it too much. It just comes up sometimes when you're kind of loading presets, but you can of course change this if you're building your own patch to be either a shared or a normal signal path. Down here we have latch and trigger modes. So latch is where you can play a note. If you have this on, you can play a note and then let go, and that note continues until you play it again, and then it stops. So if I go on something a bit quieter and I turn the part level down, this is something we'll come to in a second. Or this one here, let's try and have something that's going to sustain forever. So you can hear that this is like a BPM related patch, and I'm not playing the keyboard anymore, so it's continuing to play until I play that C again, and it'll stop. So you can use that to do stuff in a live setting, or if you like to set up these loops and stuff inside of these BPM instruments. Trigger mode is to do with basically how soon after you play the note it actually sounds. So if we choose something that's a bit more obvious, I'm going to go to my Keyscape library, and I'm just going to call up a piano, and I'm going to go back to, I'm going to cross out Keyscape and go back to Omnisphere so you can see the controls here. At the moment, I'm just playing a normal piano, right? And remember that the host tempo was 120 BPM. So if I change this to trigger next beat, what's going to happen is that my notes are going to fit in time with the host tempo. So if I play, I'm going to get the host to play with a metronome. What you can hear now I can't play in between the beats because this is triggering on the next beat, right? If we change it to trigger next 16th note, I suddenly sound like my rhythmical playing is absolutely perfect, right? Because the computer is keeping this there for me. It's keeping this all triggered. And of course, if we do trigger next bar, it's going to wait until the next bar for me to play all those notes. So let's watch the bar here. I'm going to start playing notes now, and then they all play at the beginning of the next bar. So that's what trigger mode is. At the bottom we have this simple gain, right, which is just to increase or decrease. I mentioned in a previous video that I sometimes increase or decrease this volume slider here. probably better practice within a part level to move around and have this and then save your patches like that. You also have control of the part level here, so lots of kind of different options really. And you have mute and solo controls over here, so if you've got lots of other parts playing at the same time, you can solo it there. We then have our master filter, which is kind of controlling all 4 of the layers. So if we have this as a high pass filter, we have control over that there, and we can also add in the resonance as well. So simple high pass, low pass filters. We'll go over this section in a minute. What I'm going to talk about is these 2 middle windows. So the notes one is the one that defaults when we open it up. So if we preview some more things inside of Spectrasonic, we have something that's kind of quite interesting and like the history behind it, or like how it was designed. And if we want to learn more about it, we press that plus button there, and we can see kind of who it was designed by, which library it's in, category, etc., etc. And you can zoom out of this. Now, this is a really important thing. This magnifying glass that I'm clicking on to get zoomed in and zoomed out, and you'll see this all over Omnisphere. We'll see it here in the velocity layers, the velocity settings in a minute. So that's choosing. That's the info on the patch itself, but we can also then go over to the layers, and this is kind of, as I said, the main Windows view of all 4 layers. So if we choose like, so you can see here that we've got now a number of parts loaded up inside of this one patch, African Retrospective, and particularly layer A and layer B. Layer C and D have oscillators in them for sure, but actually they're not active at the moment, and they're kind of, you'll see these on all parts. If we look up at the top here, layer A and layer B have sounds on it, and if I turn off B, we can just listen to layer A. You see that B turns off there. And if I turn that off, nothing, we don't hear anything at all. If I turn on B, and if I turn them both on together, from this window I have real kind of easy, simple access without having to go into each layer of the volume. So if I don't like the synthesis element so much, but I still want it in there, and of course I can turn these ones on as well, so noise is usually given with each part. And Juno as well. So that's a really, really handy view. And of course, if you click on here, you go into the menu version for the oscillator, or if it's a sound source, you go into the sound source browser. So it's just another way of zooming into it here. And you can also move up and down through the current library view here, just toggling up and down. Now this little plus button here is something that we'll come to in a minute. It's the sound source zoom. It's a bit more complex, and it again just shows you how full Omnisphere is as a library. There's so many different parts in it. So velocity here, velocity curve, if you don't know about it, let's just go back to a simple piano. We can hear that this piano here, if I play it really quietly, actually I'm going to bring up my Logic Pro here, my main window, so that you can see the actual velocity I'm playing. So you can hear I'm playing with like a velocity of 26 and then 50, and that means that the piano is quite quiet, right? But if I play hard, up at 117, that the velocity is responding to that, and we've got that standard velocity curve going there. Now if I change this to be flat, for example, I won't be able to play quietly or loudly. Even if I'm playing really, really loudly, everything sounds the same. And you have lots of different velocity response curves. So you have an exponential one here. I forget the name for this one, but it's the opposite of exponential. And you can change it. So here it's going to get loud really quickly. And here it's going to get loud much later. So I have to play much harder to get louder. Now, if you want more control over these settings, if you don't want just these presets, you can actually press this plus button and go into the velocity zoom, and you have more controls here. Now this looks more complex than it is if you've never seen it before. It's actually quite simple. You have the ability to control your velocity curves. So here you're going to have that exponential one, so it'll take a while to get louder, so it'll only be at the very hardest that you play that you'll be able to reach this top level. Or you can have the opposite of that, so even when you're playing really softly, you're already going to be kind of around here or even here in terms of volume level. So here I'm playing very softly, and I'm already creating quite a loud sound. And you have controls over this. Say you want everything to be really loud with not much expression, right? You want a tiny bit of expression. You can play with these knobs here. So say, okay, well, I want a tiny bit of differentiation with my velocity here, but not loads. And maybe I want it actually down here. So I want a tiny bit of differentiation with my velocity. You can hardly hear anything there, but and there's a ton of presets as well. It's kind of almost overkill what they provide, and they're presets from the kind of velocity response curves inside of all these different hardware instruments. So it's ridiculous how kind of how in depth this is. Lastly, you can of course control these velocity curves for each layer individually if that wasn't enough, but we won't get into that now because I kind of want to move on, and this video is getting on now. So I just loaded up a new patch, and you can see that solo and glide as well is enabled. I'm going to turn off glide a second, and if I play a note here and then another one and then another one, you can hear that we're only hearing the final note that I've played, and that's because it's basically a monophonic instrument, and it's forcing the previous notes to go away, and that we hear this legato shift between the first note and the next note. Now if I turn off the legato setting, all that's happening there is that our envelope is being reset. If you don't know what an envelope is, don't worry, we'll come to that later. Essentially, it's the controls over kind of the sound itself over time, to do with filters and the actual amplitude of it, but don't worry about it for now. So if we turn this back on, what that will mean is that it's still legato, and that all the subsequent notes, with all of those, the envelope won't be re-triggered. So you can hear all these subsequent notes are much softer than the initial note in terms of their kind of EQ, the different sounds that are inside it. Whereas if I play that first note again, it's got a kind of brightness and a bite to it. So that's solo. Now the glide element that's inside of solo, you can hear that there's a very, very natural kind of small little glide between notes. But if we turn this on, what we can actually do is control this and make it even longer. So you can hear there's a slide between notes there, and we can make it ridiculous if we push it up. So you can play with that there. And of course that is dependent on each layer as well, or rather you can control that just for one of the layers or two of the layers. So say if we look at these two sounds here, if we listen to A here, and then we listen to B, let's say we just wanted B to have the glide element, but not A. We could go B and turn glide on. And you can hear that B, in terms of its pitch, is lagging behind a little bit. So layer A moves immediately, and B moves up afterwards. So there's kind of a huge amount of customization there. So finally, we have our bend section where we can control the bend wheel and what that does. So currently it's set to an octave when you move down and a minor third when you move up. So let me show you what I mean. If I play a note and I use the bend wheel on my keyboard, it's going to go down an octave. But if I go up, it's going to go a minor third. But you have full control over that. You could make it 2 octaves. Or you could put it to a minor third, or anything that you want really. The most standard setting for bend wheels or pitch bend wheels is a tone up and a tone down. And you'll find a lot of patches have that in it. Finally, we have our sustain, or our sustain mode. So the standard sustain mode, if you've ever played a piano, is just exactly what you would expect, that you play a note with a sustain pedal on and it keeps going forever. If it's a kind of synth patch with no decay, or if it's kind of a pluck sound, then it'll sustain for a bit longer. But you can do it so that if you press sustain version 2, what will happen is that each subsequent note will cut off the previous one, but until you play a next note, it will still sustain it. So I'll just play you a few examples here. I'm going to play one note at a time, say with just one finger on my keyboard, whilst holding the sustain pedal down, and you'll hear that all of them have this long note in between. So it's almost like having control over the latch feature that we saw, but you can change it whenever you want. So by putting the pedal down, you can say, I want latch now for a bit, and then you take the pedal off, and then there's no latch. So it's kind of like doing that. To be honest, I don't ever really use it, but it's there. You also have your control for the expression pedal. If you want, you can turn that on or off there. So finally then we have our sound sources. And just to remind you what a sound source is, it's the thing that you load into a layer. Obviously we have 4 layers on each part, and so we want to load a sound source into layer A. And you can see on this patch that I've kind of loaded up here, it's just a patch from the Trillian library, that I have a sound source, which is my studio bass all full range. Now, if you listen to that, we're only listening to layer A. You can hear it's a very, very detailed sound source because you've got things like round robins, you've also got legato built into it. So let's zoom into this and find more detail inside of it. And this is the crazy thing about Omnisphere, is inside of here you have all this customization on just one sound source. So on the left hand side here we have basically, we can see that there are 4 different sound source kind of parts almost inside of one sound source. So these ones aren't even being used here, so I'm just going to turn those off. We can see that we've got direct pickup here, and that's the one that we're listening to. Even though this one is on, the volume is all the way down, and you can see actually that my kind of the loading of the RAM, whatever's being loaded into RAM, is changing every time I turn one of these on and off. So the sound won't change now. That's what we were listening to before, it's the direct pickup. But if we want to listen to this other sound source that was recorded with this sound source, we could turn this on and turn this up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down so that we're not listening to it. So a kind of a different quality, and if we pull them both in, we get both of them together. There's a really interesting sound to that, I think. Very, very subtle, but you can kind of play around with this, and every time you load up a sound source, there is the possibility that we'll have options on this page here, and it just shows the detail in the sampling. On the right here, we have these other sections here. So these will be specific, or rather they will be relevant to only certain kinds of instruments. So I've loaded up this bass patch because I know it would be more useful for this tutorial. Sometimes this won't apply with certain Omnisphere patches. So just beware of that one. So the first area we have, obviously legato, pedal and damper, is release. So release is what happens after you let go of the key here, right? And if I turn this all the way up, you might be able to hear something. So when I let go there, what you can hear is it's almost like the sound of the person letting go of the bass string is also heard. Not yet, but when I let go, you can hear there's a little sort of tweak there. Now, that's quite cool. I can turn that up, or I can just turn it off so we can have a less real sound and we don't get any release sound. And you can set keyboard tracking as well, and the transition time. So the transition time would be, if I turn this up again, sorry. It's just a few more, however many thousand milliseconds, 1 second between the let go and then the sound. So it's at this end it's a bit less realistic, but to be honest, this is one of those parameters you don't need to mess around with tracking in this. I would just leave it. But the cool thing is you have access to all the other types of releases for this instrument. So I could do something weird with so we could have the sound of the bass when you play the note, but then something like a wing upright piano release sound, so like an old upright piano. So if you listen, I'll play the bass note, and then as soon as I let go, you'll hear something that's kind of akin to a piano. You can hear a piano at the end of it, which is a bit weird. And obviously the settings I have at the moment are a bit obvious, a bit too loud. So you can see that there's potential here to really add lots and lots of interest, and you can even do very subtle things. You could say, well, actually, I want the release noise for my studio bass to actually not be a studio bass, but be a clean Fender release. I mean, I hardly notice the difference, but a bass player would probably notice the difference. So that's what that's going on there. And you have these different controls here over the mode, but I'm not going to go into that too much because it is just a bit overkill, really. Down here we have our legato settings. I'm just going to reset this to the original controls or the original settings. So legato, when you have a legato patch, you can hear that if I play this note here and play a note just above it, I can simulate the actual sound source itself has this wonderful legato simulation of hammer-ons on a bass. Now, if I play over a major second, like a major third, you can hear that's not happening. Basically, what the instrument is currently thinking is it's saying, okay, you're playing this note, and you don't want this to be a hammer-on, you want it to be a separate note, so that you can play major thirds, or anything larger than a major second you can play at the same time. But we can change this. So if I say I wanted to do a hammer-on that was larger than this, say I wanted to do a hammer-on that was actually like a perfect fifth, or anything inside of a perfect fifth, if I'm holding a note like F, and I play, say, an A, that's going to be a perfect fifth. If I play a B flat, if I play a B, and a C, everything in between those notes is going to be hammer-ons, and that also works going down as well. But anything beyond a perfect fifth, so for example F up to a D, is now not going to be a hammer-on. So the most standard setting is to have this as a major second or perhaps a third, either a minor or a major, and you can play around with that here. So I'm going to put this back to a major second. Pedal noise is kind of relevant for patches which have pedal involved in them. So for example, keyscape patches, anything that's to do with using a pedal on the instrument. So you can basically add in noise and apply the effects which are to the pedal noise itself or not. So you can take off effects for the pedal noise itself. And then damper is basically something that's on real pianos, and you can say, okay, I'd want no damper above this note here. But again, it's really, really specific sound, kind of sound source editing in here. We've seen the info panel, which is just another way of looking at it. You can look at more info as well. And then of course you can see the thinning page. So the thinning page just remains the same as the edit page on the left, but the right hand side changes to controls about your samples. So again, I'm going to leave this now because this video has gotten super long. You can refer to the manual on this area. If I just bring it up, you can find this at support.spectrasonics.net/manual and then Omnisphere 2. And you can see this on the, I believe it was the, oh yeah, down here. So you have your sound source zoom, and then you want to go to thinning area. And it basically explains the controls that you have over how you sample thin stuff. So you can actually train the instrument on the notes that you've actually played. So for example, say you've got a really a full instrument that's using lots of CPU, lots of RAM, but you only want it for say 4 notes. You can start training, play those notes, and then finish training, and then you can see that this updated here, and now the theoretically Omnisphere is just having to think about those 4 notes. I think that was 4 notes, 4 or 5, whatever it was. So there we go. That's probably one of the longer videos that I'll be doing in this tutorial series. Let me know how they are, whether they're too fast, too slow, whether you want me to kind of apply stuff a bit more inside of a session and be a bit more practical. It's one of those huge instruments that's very hard to kind of sum up quickly, which is why I'm doing this bit by bit in a kind of a YouTube course. See you in the next one.